A Marine's struggle and Trump's unscripted response. The White House lawn stretched wide under the bright afternoon sun, a sea of pristine uniforms and polished metals glinting in the light. It was a day of ceremony, flags waving, speeches honoring the military, and the national anthem soaring through the air. A celebration of service, sacrifice, and patriotism. President Donald Trump stood at the center of it all, shaking hands with generals, nodding as high-ranking officers expressed their gratitude, exchanging pleasantries with dignitaries. The cameras followed his every move. Journalists scribbled notes, and the world watched. But then, something pulled his attention away. At the edge of the crowd, just outside the official seating area, a lone Marine stood apart. He wasn't slouching or disengaged, on the contrary. His stance was rigid, his uniform impeccable, his ribbons in perfect order. Everything about him screamed discipline. But it was his eyes that caught Trump's attention. There was something buried there, a weight, a heaviness that no metal could erase. Trump had met thousands of servicemen and women before. But this was different. He turned slightly, motioning for his aides and security to stay back. Then, without a word, he stepped away from the structured order of the event and began walking toward the Marine. The cameras hesitated, then pivoted sharply, capturing the moment. Sergeant Daniel Briggs stiffened the second he saw Trump approaching. He had been in enough ceremonial events to know how these things went. The president would shake his hand, maybe say, "Thank you for your service," and then move on. But as Trump stopped in front of him, there was no quick handshake, no hurried pleasantries. Instead, the president studied him, not the way a politician looks at a voter, but the way a man looks at another man, measuring something deeper. Trump extended his hand. "What's your name, son?" Briggs hesitated for just a second before responding. "Sergeant Daniel Briggs, sir." Trump gripped his hand firmly, holding it a second longer than expected. His eyes didn't leave Briggs' face. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," Trump said. His tone wasn't rehearsed, it was personal. "What's going on?" Briggs swallowed. He felt the weight of the cameras pressing in. The dozens, no, hundreds, of eyes on him. He could play it safe, say something polite, and let this moment pass. But something about Trump's tone, the way he asked, the way he waited, made it impossible to brush off. Briggs exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm not sure this is the right place." Trump shook his head. "Right place, wrong place, doesn't matter. Talk to me." Briggs hesitated again. Years of training had drilled into him the importance of keeping it together. Marines didn't complain. Marines didn't make excuses. But here was the commander-in-chief, standing right in front of him, asking him to speak. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone in power actually wanted to listen. He took a slow breath, eyes locking onto Trump's. Then, with the cameras rolling, the crowd silent, and the entire world watching, Sergeant Briggs started talking. A soldier's battle back home. Sergeant Daniel Briggs had spent his entire career following orders, keeping his emotions in check, and pushing through pain. But standing there, face to face with the President of the United States, he felt something shift. This wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a staged moment. Trump was looking at him like he expected an answer. Briggs took a breath, his voice steady, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. "I've served 15 years. Sir, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I've been in combat. I've lost friends. I've done my job. No complaints." His jaw clenched slightly before he continued. "But coming home, that's been the hardest part." Trump nodded slightly, listening, not the way politicians usually did. Distracted, waiting for their turn to speak. No, he was actually hearing him. Briggs exhaled, forcing himself to keep going. "My wife, Naomi, she's a nurse, or she was. Had to leave her job to take care of our son. He was born with cerebral palsy. Needs full-time care." He paused, rubbing his thumb against his palm, the only sign of his frustration. "We tried everything. The VA, state assistance. Took months just to get someone on the phone." His voice tightened. "The bills don't stop, though. The debt doesn't stop. I re-enlisted just to keep a paycheck coming. But now I'm up against it. We're drowning, sir." He hadn't meant to say that last part out loud. But there it was, out in the open. The words hung between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Trump's face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a deeper understanding. A recognition of something he had seen before. Men who gave everything only to come back to nothing. Briggs swallowed hard. He wasn't looking for pity. He wasn't asking for a handout. He just wanted to understand why it had to be this way. He forced himself to stand taller, pushing back against the raw emotion clawing its way to the surface. He was a Marine. Marines don't break. I'm not asking for anything special, he said, his voice firm now. I just don't understand how a man can serve his country, risk his life for it, and come back to nothing. The silence that followed was heavy. The kind that made people shift in their seats. The kind that made cameras zoom in, capturing every detail of the moment. Trump exhaled sharply, his gaze darkening. That's not right, he muttered, shaking his head, then louder. For the cameras, for the crowd, for the country. That's not how this is supposed to work. And just like that, everything changed. A turning point. The following morning, a presidential directive was issued. A full investigation into VA processing delays. A task force dedicated to improving military benefits. Direct intervention for families like the Briggs. By the end of the month, the VA backlog had been reduced. Assistance programs were streamlined. And Sergeant Daniel Briggs? His family received the care they deserved. But it wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran who had felt abandoned. Every soldier who had been forgotten. One voice had spoken up, and a nation had listened. Some called it a political stunt. Others called it leadership. But for the Briggs family, and thousands of others, it was something far greater. It was hope. A president, a Marine, and a promise that changed everything. The sun hung high over the White House lawn, casting a bright sheen over rows of uniforms, polished metals, and the crisp folds of American flags swaying in the breeze. It was supposed to be a day of ceremony, a moment to honor those who had served. But now, it was something else, something bigger. The cameras had been rolling. The press had been taking notes. But no one, not even the journalists trained to expect the unexpected, had anticipated this. President Donald Trump stood face to face with Sergeant Daniel Briggs, a Marine whose rigid posture and unwavering stare spoke of discipline, but whose eyes carried a weight that no amount of training could mask. You're telling me you've done your duty, and the government turned its back on you? Briggs held his stare. Yes, sir. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The crowd, the press, the aides standing nearby, they all felt it. The weight of truth, the rawness of it. Trump turned slightly, glancing toward his team. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. But then resolve settled in. Where's my chief of staff? He called out, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade. An aide scrambled away, moving quickly. Briggs blinked. What was happening? He had been in the system long enough to know how this worked. Politicians said they cared, made vague promises, then moved on. But this felt different. Trump turned back to him, his voice low but firm. We're fixing this. And for the first time in years, Briggs felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The turning point. The tension thickened as a White House aide hurried off. The press pool, which had been covering the event with routine interest, snapped to full alert. Microphones extended. Cameras zoomed in. News producers whispered urgently into earpieces. Something was happening. Something unscripted. Sergeant Briggs shifted slightly, keeping his posture locked in place. But his mind raced. This wasn't just talk. Trump crossed his arms, his expression unreadable as he studied the Marine. You said you reached out to the VA. Trump said, his voice steady but sharp. How long did it take to get a response? Briggs clenched his jaw. 8 months, sir. And? Briggs exhaled sharply. And even then, they told us they were backlogged. The words sent a shockwave through the onlookers. 8 months. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably. The press leaned in closer. Even some of the military officials in attendance looked uneasy. Trump exhaled, shaking his head. That's not just incompetence, that's a disgrace. His words cut through the murmurs, slicing straight through the political noise. We have billions for foreign aid. Billions for useless government programs. And you're telling me we can't take care of the men and women who fought for this country? The murmurs grew louder. Just then, Tony O'Brien, Trump's chief of staff, appeared, slightly out of breath. Mr. President. Trump didn't take his eyes off Briggs. This Marine has been hung out to dry, he said, his voice carrying across the entire lawn. His kid has cerebral palsy. His wife had to quit working. The VA isn't doing a damn thing. O'Brien hesitated. Sir, Trump raised a hand, cutting him off. No excuses. I want his case on my desk today. And I want a full audit of VA delays. Every case like his. Every soldier or Marine getting screwed over. I want names, numbers, reports. By tonight. O'Brien nodded quickly and stepped away, already pulling out his phone. Briggs stood in stunned silence. He had spent years buried under government red tape, ignored by agencies that moved at a glacial pace. Now, in less than 2 minutes, the President of the United States had thrown the entire system into motion. Trump turned toward the gathered press, his voice clear and unwavering. We say we support our troops. We love to say it. But what the hell does that mean if we let them come home to this? If a man is willing to lay down his life for this country, then this country better damn well take care of him when he gets back. The statement hit hard. Some of the reporters, even the ones used to grilling him, paused. Because this wasn't politics. This was personal. Trump looked back at Briggs. You said you weren't asking for handouts. Good, because you shouldn't have to. He extended his hand again. I don't forget people. We're fixing this. Today. Briggs hesitated for half a second before taking the handshake. His grip was firm, but his mind reeled. A handshake wasn't supposed to mean anything. But this one did. And as the press scrambled to capture the moment, one thing became crystal clear. This story was just getting started. The aftermath. The moment the handshake happened, the press lost control. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Reporters shouted over one another. News producers scrambled to push the footage live. Mr. President, do you think this is political grandstanding? Will this actually lead to change? Or is this just a public stunt? What about the VA's budget? Where's the funding going to come from? Trump, still gripping Briggs' hand, turned slightly toward the press but didn't let go. His voice cut through the frenzy. I don't give a damn about how this looks, he said, his eyes locking onto a CNN correspondent. I care about results. This man served his country. His family is suffering, and I'm not letting bureaucrats bury this in paperwork while his kid suffers. The reporters froze for half a second, just long enough for the weight of his words to land. A change that mattered. The following morning, a presidential directive was issued. A full investigation into VA processing delays. A task force dedicated to improving military benefits. Direct intervention for families like the Briggs. By the end of the month, the VA backlog had been reduced. Assistance programs were streamlined. And Sergeant Daniel Briggs? His family received the care they deserved. But it wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran who had felt abandoned. Every soldier who had been forgotten. One voice had spoken up, and a nation had listened. A nation awakens. The fight to fix the VA. The clip of Trump and Sergeant Daniel Briggs had detonated across the nation like a political earthquake. The White House lawn confrontation, unscripted and raw, was no longer just a moment, it was a movement. By morning, every major news network had gone into overdrive. Fox News ran the headline. Trump goes to war for veterans, demands VA overhaul on the spot. CNN countered. Trump uses struggling Marine as political prop. Is this real reform or a stunt? MSNBC featured a panel debating whether this was a genuine call to action or just another headline moment that would fade by next week. But outside the media bubble, something else was happening. For the first time in years, veterans across the country were speaking up. The floodgates open. Former Army Ranger Mike Ramirez posted a viral tweet. Sergeant Briggs isn't alone. I spent a year fighting the VA just to get my PTSD treatment approved. This system is broken. A Navy widow, Jessica McAdams, shared a heartbreaking post about her late husband, who had died waiting for medical care. The VA didn't just fail him, it killed him. Within hours, hashtags like #FixTheVA and #VeteransDeserveBetter were trending nationally. But while social media exploded, a storm was brewing behind the scenes. Panic at the VA headquarters. Inside VA headquarters, top officials were panicking. Calls poured in from the White House. High-ranking administrators were summoned for late-night emergency meetings. Pressure was mounting. In a conference room packed with bureaucrats and political aides, the tension was palpable. We need a statement, one official said, sweat beading on his forehead. Something that says we're handling this. Handling this? Another snapped. We've got the president demanding full reform, a national firestorm, and veterans calling us criminals. You think a press release is going to fix that? Silence. No one had an answer. Because the truth was, this wasn't just a PR problem. It was a structural failure. And now, the entire country knew. Inside the White House, the battle begins. Meanwhile, at the White House, Trump sat in the Oval Office, his desk covered in stacks of veteran case files. Some were like Briggs' story, months, even years of delays. Others were worse. Veterans who had died waiting for care. Families who had lost everything fighting the system. Widows left in financial ruin. Trump leaned back, flipping through a file, shaking his head. This is worse than I thought. His chief of staff, Tony O'Brien, shifted uncomfortably. The VA has been broken for decades. Too much bureaucracy. Too much wasted money. Trump's fingers drummed against the desk. Who's responsible for this mess? O'Brien hesitated. Technically, the VA secretary. But Trump cut him off. Fire him. O'Brien exhaled sharply. Mr. President, that's complicated. Firing a cabinet member over this will send shockwaves through the administration. Trump leaned forward, eyes locked on his chief of staff. Good. Let them feel it. A political shockwave. Within 24 hours, the Veterans Affairs Secretary was dismissed. Breaking news. Trump fires VA Secretary amid veteran crisis, promises immediate overhaul. Veterans watched in disbelief. For years, they had filed complaints, written letters, waited months, years, for answers. And now, in less than 2 days, heads were rolling. This wasn't just political theater. This was real action. A political shockwave. Within 24 hours, the Veterans Affairs Secretary was dismissed. Breaking news. Trump fires VA Secretary amid veteran crisis, promises immediate overhaul. Veterans watched in disbelief. For years, they had filed complaints, written letters, waited months, years, for answers. And now, in less than 2 days, heads were rolling. This wasn't just political theater. This was real action. Sergeant Briggs, the unexpected face of a movement. At his small Arlington home, Sergeant Briggs sat at the kitchen table, watching the news with his wife, Naomi. She hadn't said much since the footage aired. Now, her fingers tightened around his hand, her expression unreadable. You realize what you've started, right? She whispered. Briggs exhaled slowly. I didn't start anything. I just told the truth. Naomi shook her head. No, Daniel, you did something nobody else had the chance to do. She met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. You made them listen. The war wasn't over yet. While the nation debated and veterans found their voices, a hidden war had begun, one that could either cement real change or crush everything before it even started. Would the bureaucracy fight back? Would Washington stall? Would this momentum lead to real reform? One thing was certain. The veterans weren't staying silent anymore. And neither was Trump. Because now, the whole world was watching. A fight bigger than one man. The morning after Trump's announcement, the news cycle exploded. Trump fires VA Secretary in shock move, promises immediate reform. The media erupted. Some called it reckless. Others called it bold leadership. But among veterans, the reaction was different. For the first time in years, they saw something real. Something that wasn't just words. A firestorm at the Briggs home. Back at the Briggs home, Sergeant Daniel Briggs sat on his couch, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. Messages poured in, fellow Marines thanking him for speaking up. Veterans sharing their own horror stories with the VA. Reporters begging for an exclusive interview. And then there were the threats. Anonymous emails. Voicemails calling him a pawn. A sellout. A liar. He clenched his jaw. He had faced enemy fire overseas. But this was something else. Beside him, Naomi sat with her arms crossed. You're not reading those, are you? Briggs didn't answer. She exhaled, reaching for his hand. Listen to me, you didn't ask for this. I know that, but you did start something. Her voice softened. And now you have to decide, do you keep fighting? Or do you walk away? His phone buzzed again. A call from the White House. Briggs exhaled. He already knew what was coming. He answered. Yes, sir? Trump's voice was direct. I need you in Washington tomorrow. Briggs hesitated. Mr. President, no excuses. Trump interrupted. "I want you in the room when we overhaul the VA. You started this fight, and you're going to help me finish it." Briggs felt his heart hammering in his chest. He was just a Marine, not a politician. But walking away? That wasn't an option. The flight to Washington. As Briggs boarded his flight the next morning, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every veteran who had ever been forgotten. And this time, they weren't going to be ignored. The meeting that changed everything. Washington, D.C. The White House Situation Room. Sergeant Briggs stepped into a world he had never imagined. The room was packed with some of the most powerful figures in Washington. Generals, lawmakers, VA officials. At the head of the table, Trump sat with his arms crossed, eyes locked on the VA's acting director. "Tell me," Trump said, his voice low but sharp. "Why am I hearing that it takes months, sometimes years, for veterans to get basic care?" The acting VA director cleared his throat. "Sir, the system is complex. There are regulations." Trump leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care about excuses. I care about results." The room went dead silent. Briggs felt the weight of the moment. This was real. This was happening. Trump turned to him. "Sergeant, tell them what you told me." Briggs took a slow breath. And then he spoke. The voices of the forgotten. Briggs didn't sugarcoat anything. The shockwave hits Washington. Breaking news. Trump unveils emergency VA reforms. No more delays for veterans. Trump puts bureaucrats on notice. Veteran affairs overhaul begins immediately. The media firestorm reignited. MSNBC accused Trump of grandstanding. CNN questioned if the reforms were realistic. But veterans? They weren't debating. They were cheering. Finally, someone who actually gives a damn. Trump is doing what no one else would. "I don't care about politics, this is leadership." He spoke about the veterans lost in the system. He spoke about his wife having to quit her job to care for their disabled son. He spoke about Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen fighting another war, against the VA itself. When he finished, the room was silent. Trump nodded once, then turned back to his staff. "We fix this. Now." An explosion of movement followed. Emergency reforms were drafted. Fast-track approval processes were put into motion. Deadlines were set. Trump wasn't asking for change. He was demanding it. Sergeant Briggs. From forgotten to fighter. Back at home, Briggs sat with Naomi, watching the news. She turned to him, shaking her head. "Daniel, you did it." He exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "No, we did it. And for the first time in years." He believed it. Battle wasn't over yet. The reforms were just beginning. Would Washington fight back? Would the bureaucracy resist? Would this be real change or just another promise lost in the system? One thing was certain. The veterans weren't staying silent anymore. And neither was Trump. Because now, the whole world was watching. A lesson from the story. Stand up for what's right. The story of Sergeant Briggs and President Trump is a powerful reminder that real change starts when people refuse to stay silent. Too often, systems fail the very people they are meant to protect. And bureaucracy buries urgent issues under endless paperwork. But one voice, when backed by courage and the right leadership, can force action. In life, whether it's standing up for yourself, your family, or a cause that matters, never assume your voice doesn't count. Speak up, demand better, because real change only happens when people fight for it.